And I think we should start. Welcome, everybody. This is the Social Justice Advisory Board's third gathering. I'm delighted to see such a healthy turnout for what promises to be an informative and no doubt sometimes sobering discussion. Criminal justice reform and racial profiling and the intersection with gun violence is an all too current topic. There's much in need of TEkun, of repair. We look forward to hearing and learning how those of us in this Zoom room can be effective agents of change. We'll leave time at the end for Q&A. Just unmute yourself. We're not going to type questions into the chat. Tonight we'll hear from three speakers. Donald Osgood, welcome. Coalition member of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. Senator Cynthia Stone Cream, who represents the 1st Middlesex and Norfolk counties in the Massachusetts legislature and a Temple Emmanuel member. Welcome. And Ruth Zacharin, Executive Director of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, who will be in the dual role of participant and moderator. We begin with a prayer from Rabbi Aliza.
Welcome, everyone. There's a mitzvah that's outlined in Deuteronomy 22:8. When you build a home, we are instructed that you have to build a fence around that home. And the commentators understand that fence in twofold. One, the positive commandment that anything you build, you have to be thinking about how you can safeguard any mishap, any misfortune that could happen in that space. And two, within that mitzvah is a commandment to be thinking about any dangerous objects, any obstacles, any situations that could unfold in your home. And you have to remove those, or you have to put fences around them. So our prayer tonight, we are doing this work of ma'akeh, this work of building fences and thinking about the fences that need to be built, and the ways that we can make our community home a safer place. And so our prayer is that, sweet loving Lord, we ask you to be present with us, to instruct us and to guide us so that we can have the most effective conversation, so that we can learn the tools that we need to succeed, to create a community and a world where we are all safe and we all get to feel like we're at home.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. So we're going to hand it over now to Ruth. Ruth, take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Rabbi Aliza. That was really lovely and a really great way to ground our conversation today. So again, my name is Ruth Zacharin, and I'm always honored to be able to say that I am the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And this evening I'll be playing, as was mentioned, a dual role of both speaking to you about the topics at hand, as well as moderating the conversation. And I'm so glad to be in community with all of you, as well as Senator Cream and my colleague and friend, Donald Osgood. And just a couple of things I wanted to mention before we dive in. One is that for me, it's also really nice to be with the Temple Emmanuel community. I actually have a long-standing connection, having spent multiple Wednesdays driving my kids to USY events at Temple Emmanuel, particularly the year that my son was president of the region. So I have spent many a Wednesday evening hanging around waiting for USY meetings and events to be over so I could chauffeur everyone home. So I have a long-standing connection with the Temple Emmanuel community. And it's also really nice, particularly this week, as we are waiting for Governor Baker to hopefully sign the bill for the allocations of the American Rescue Plan, to be in community with Senator Cream and Donald Osgood, as we've also had a pretty significant connection around that work. Several months ago, the coalition convened a working group and then a broader coalition to really think about how we could utilize American Rescue Plan dollars to support community-based and community-led initiatives to address violence And Donald has been a part of that effort since moment one, helping us really craft our core values for that ask as well as the language. And Senator Cream has been an incredible champion in this process of really supporting the ask and making sure that it made it into the final version of the bill, which now awaits a signature from Governor Baker. So it's really nice to just be in community with all of you and to have those connections. So our charge for tonight is to begin a conversation about issues of violence prevention, racial disparity, policing, reform of the criminal legal system. And so we have some questions that we want to work through with the panel. And then, as was mentioned, open it up for general Q&A and conversation at the end, and hopefully we'll be able to get to everyone's questions. But as a way to begin, a little bit of introduction, I'm going to ask everyone to respond to the first question, which is just a little bit more about what you do in the world, and what is your connection to the issue and the work of gun violence prevention and reform of the criminal legal system. And I'll ask Senator Cream to get us started.
Thank you, Ruth. I too want to echo the same sentiments as a member of the temple and as having a husband, grandchildren that were bar mitzvahed and bat mitzvahed from the temple. It's great to be on this panel, and it's great to see the shared values that I feel and that my temple members feel, because we are all in this together. And if we don't fight the same wars and take the same position, we're going to talk about how we can never succeed unless we do this together. So I've been involved, obviously, with the gun violence community, the Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, and I started filing bills on gun violence from the moment I was elected. I got elected and I filed a bill, which now to say all these years later, we're still talking about it. It was the 1 gun a month bill. And when I spoke about that, my husband always said, "That's so embarrassing. Who would buy more than 1 gun a month?" Well, I haven't been able to pass that bill. And one of the reasons that I'm so anxious to have some reports on data collection is I want to prove the fact of where are these guns coming from, how it comes getting into the hands of young people. Are there multiple sales? Are there straw sales? And so one thing we want to do is do it through data. But in 2014, 2 years after the Newtown shooting, the legislature passed a comprehensive gun licensing reform bill. I was involved with that bill. I was on the conference committee. The Senate appoints 3 members of a conference committee, work with 3 members of the House to try and draft a bill that both chambers can vote on. And this law, among other things, provided police chiefs additional discretion in granting firearm licenses. So this was 2014. And the police chiefs did not have discretion on whether to license rifles, where they did have some discretion with handguns. With rifles, they had to automatically issue licenses. This bill gave them discretion. So maybe we could, certainly the police saw that there were people that shouldn't have these guns and they had discretion now. We expanded the background checks on all purchasing of firearms. We still have more to do on that. I'd have another bill on that. And for the first time, we required all licensing authorities to trace and collect specific data on any firearm use. But that data has been collected and there have been reports, but the underlying information that data was based on has not been public. So that is the bill we're working on now to make those things public. But and that's the crime gun data collection bill, which I'm the lead sponsor and the coalition is supporting in this term. In addition to that, I filed a bill this year to stop, I thought it was to stop mass shootings. So you know that Massachusetts prohibits the sale of assault weapons in Massachusetts, but that does not prevent the companies who make the assault weapons to sell them out of Massachusetts. And the weapons that we use in Aurora, the weapons that we used all over the country were made by companies here in Massachusetts. Now, I don't know where that will go, but I filed that. So if they cannot sell them in Massachusetts, my feeling is they should not be selling them elsewhere. Nobody needs an assault weapon. That's a loophole that we never closed. And so, they're used for mass murder. We should not be selling them elsewhere. They increase the likelihood of multiple murders. They're for military use. They're not for like a handgun. So I also filed another bill which would ban sale of 50 caliber ammunition and increase the sales tax on ammunition to support gun violence programs. All these bills sound like, why wouldn't they happen? But there's a lot of lobbying going on by the NRA, and the gun owners of America are very strong and have a lot of money in comparison to our coalition. So these things that seem like no-brainers don't get passed, and they're not no-brainers, even in Massachusetts. In addition, after the mass shootings in Las Vegas, I led the Senate in banning the use of so-called bump stock. So bump stock was used in that shooting. It was a device that enabled a shooter to turn his semi-automatic weapon into a machine gun. And it was that kind of device. I was pleased I was able to work bipartisanly with members to ban that. And that after that, there was some of those lobby groups that were opposed to that, but we did ban that. And I led the Senate in passing a red flag law. The red flag law provides a process for family members of local or the local licensing authority to have the guns removed from an otherwise licensed gun owner if the person is perceived to be a threat to himself or others. How could that be that your family would see that someone was a threat and they had a gun and the police couldn't come in and get that? We did pass a red flag law, and I'm proud that we do this very slowly, but we have been moving along. And one thing I found interesting about the red flag law is how it interacts with issues of suicide behavioral health. And we talk about gun issues as being public health. And I think we do well when we talk about that. In fact, the money that is going to be in this American Rescue Plan, what happened is we separated and segregated a grant program where we could, people could apply, or organizations could apply for money for programs to prevent gun violence. But those fundings, as we did in the budgets, are under the auspices of public health. So we hopefully are moving towards making people understand that gun violence is a public health problem because where do we see people murdered from guns? Where do we see the wholesale use of guns? In areas areas that are not the same areas that Temple Emmanuel is in, areas where people of color, those are areas where we're finding that, mothers of young Black boys are pretty scared when they go out at night. It's not like our kids that walk down to the playground I know I've met with many of those mothers, with heart in their mouth. They leave their sons, go out, and they don't know if they're going to come back. And that's what's happening in areas of our country that we need to do something about. So, and also we had an Omnibus Gun Bill in 2018. We have been moving along to try and do more and more to prevent gun violence. We're nowhere near done, but if we have troubles in Massachusetts, you can imagine what the rest of the country is like. So that was my introduction to and my continued interest in gun violence and my working. I'm so honored to work with Ruth. She's pretty dynamic and very focused, and it's really a pleasure working with her, and I hope to continue doing that. So thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cream. And if we don't say it enough, we just so appreciate the partnership with you and all of the advocacy that you do on behalf of these bills and on behalf of the cause and the root causes of violence as well. This is going to be a great segue. We're going to talk more about gun violence as a public health issue in a bit. But first, I want to give Donald a chance to also respond to the question and talk a little bit more about what he does in the world and his connection to the issues of gun violence prevention and reform of the criminal legal system. Donald.
Thank you again, Ruth, and from the Temple Appreciate you, Senator Cream. Donald Osgood and myself, I've been doing this work officially since 2013. Prior to that, 2008, I volunteered with a community organization to, just give back. I survived the 90s and, I was on both sides of the gun and knives and things like that. And as I got older, I decided, I want to give back and show the young men a different, an alternative to what they think they have to do. And so I was volunteering. I started working with Street Safe Boston, directly with a lot of the proven risk individuals. I also worked with the trauma response team at Boston Medical through Street Safe Boston. And from there, I went to the city of Boston, the Interrupters program. And from there, I went to the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute. From there, now I'm at the Boston Public Health Commission, and I manage the incidents of violence in 9 neighborhoods throughout the city of Boston. So that's my introduction. I'm very passionate about this work. I have 5 sons, 2 daughters, a lot of nephews, a lot of cousins, but I look at the city of Boston as everybody that's younger than me is like a son, a nephew, a daughter, a brother, sister. So that's why I do this work. I want to see it where we can all just, walk to the corner store without worries. So yeah, that's my little bit. Because I could talk a lot, so I'm gonna curb myself.
Thank you, Donald. Donald is also a board officer of the coalition, and it has truly been my honor to be working in strong community with Donald throughout the past couple of years. And so I just want to express my appreciation for you and everything that you do to support me and the work of the coalition. And I will jump in just with a brief introduction of myself. As was mentioned before, I'm the executive director of the coalition. I assumed that position in May of 2019, so it's about 2.5 years now. And I'm also the inaugural executive director. There was a group of really amazing and fierce volunteers that came before me that put the coalition together and created the foundation for the work that we do now. My prior work was really focused on the issues of domestic and sexual violence. And that's the lens that I bring to the work of gun violence prevention. And I really entered the conversation about guns and the role of guns in our communities and the trauma of gun violence because of that work. Really specifically, for the 11 years that I worked in Brockton, we were the program that served young people, served children in the aftermath of a domestic violence homicide, most often perpetrated with a gun. And it was working with those young people, supporting them through the funeral and through the acute grieving process and just ongoing, and really sitting in close proximity to the trauma of violence that compelled me to want to swim a little farther upstream and do some work around policy and culture change, and really changing the narrative around the role of guns in our society and in our communities. And so I bring a lens of doing trauma response work to the work of policymaking and public awareness and culture change. And in that, I also really started to explore the intersection of violence prevention and criminal justice reform and asking a lot of questions. We had a lot more questions than answers, particularly at the beginning. And over the past few years, our work at the coalition has really embraced the concept that foundational to violence prevention is also looking at the criminal legal system and making change and reform. Because if the systems that are supposed to keep us safe aren't working, or aren't working for everyone, or aren't keeping us safe, then we're going to have a hard time preventing violence. And racial and economic disparity factors into all of these things just so prominently that we've really adopted a pretty holistic approach at the coalition and trying to address all of those root causes and those intersections as we think about the work of violence prevention. So I'm going to move us on to our next question. I sort of gave a little glimpse on what I just said, but I would love it if everyone could reflect a bit about how gun violence and how violence prevention intersects with racial and economic disparity, and how do all of those pieces come together. And I'll go in reverse order this time. And Donald, if you wouldn't mind going first, that would be great.
Yeah, gun violence. Ooh, so how it intersects. You know, I have like different views on some of the gun stuff because I think about, you know, Senator Cream talked about how, you know, the guns like Springfield, you know, they were Smith and Wesson, they were in Springfield making guns. And I think once you started working on that bill, they decided to move. I don't even know which state they decided to move to. You know, kudos to them for leaving. But, you know, to your point that they would still, you know, sell those same guns. And then I think about living in Boston. And, you know, I'm in the middle of Dorchester. And I'm in the middle of a lot of, you know, the things that happen. And so I'm hearing a lot of those, you know, fully automatic weapons with, you know, 50-round clips and things like that. And so when I think about, you know, how race plays a part in it and, you know, the economic piece, it's something that I would love to see that I don't think happens enough. And I would like to see people who actually have money, right? Because a lot of these young fellas that carry these big guns, they don't have jobs. You know, they're not making enough money to buy a $500 gun. So however that gun is getting into the community, I feel like there needs to be a lot more accountability or responsibility towards those who may have purchased those guns, to your other point, you know, maybe buying 5 guns and selling those 4 guns, keeping one in the neighborhood where I live. And then when it's found that that gun is connected to a person who actually had access to buy it, they should be held accountable if that gun was involved in a homicide or even like a major shooting, right? Where, you know, if they didn't report it stolen, say the first few days, you know, like some of these guns are found out like a year later, 2 years later, that they need to do some time. And I feel like the reason being is that race issue, right? Because if, you know, me and Ruth were talking about was that a senator or a congressman, Ruth? I forget which one it was, but him and his family, the day after the Michigan shooting, you know, all of them had guns, you know, and so I feel like there needs to be a bigger accountability piece. But if that would have been a Black congressman, senator, mayor, or whomever, you know, he would have been prosecuted by the media immediately. And so that piece where race is, I feel like we need to, you know, be a little more fair when we deal with that issue. So yeah, that's my 25 cents to that.
Thank you, Donald. I'm going to pass it to Senator Cream.
Thank you, Donald. So as I said before, communities impacted by gun violence are disproportionately low-income communities of color. Poverty and race are so often correlated. Because of the policy we make it harder for people of color to build wealth and pass it on to future generations. And we need to look holistically at our whole criminal justice system, because not only do we need to take guns away and look at making it harder, but we have to be dealing with the people that are in our criminal justice system. There's a correlation between taking people, trying to get them jobs, taking them out of those areas where they live, educating them, diversion programs. We did a lot in 2018 on our criminal justice system, but there's more to be done. And that's really where the interaction between gun violence and race is. I've been working on various legislation that deals with racial disparity, like facial recognition, like things like that, where people if you have facial recognition, the facial recognition algorithm doesn't always recognize somebody of color. So it's often that they're put up as the suspect. You've been reading in the paper our parole system and how flawed that is, and how people sit in prison and don't come out, and many are not guilty. We have a bad system of people sitting in prison that aren't even charged. They can't meet bail. So there is a huge interaction between what we do to prevent gun violence and what we do to our criminal justice system, and how we make it easier for our young people to learn, to have jobs, to have diversion. Even raising the age of juveniles is something you look at. I've been involved in that, raising the age, and I have a bill to raise the age, because these young people go to prison, many of whom their brains aren't even developed, that they make judgments that based on what they understand. So we need to look at both. We need to take the guns off the street, but we need to look at those people who are more subject to carrying guns, or those communities that are more disproportionately affected by the use of guns, and do something about that. So it just doesn't end with taking the guns away and out of their hands. It's much bigger.
Thank you for that. And Donald, I know you had another piece that you wanted to add, so I just want to pass it back to you.
As Senator Green was talking, I was thinking about folks coming out of the prison system, and expanding quarry checks for people with guns. And I know me and Ruth talked about this a while back, because I feel like it's the quarry is a racial disparity as well, because it actually prohibits a lot of Black and brown men, Latino men and women, from jobs and things like that. So I would even like us to, reevaluate some of those things that we do, and really have more people. And I think that's the last question, but have more people who are impacted by the guns involved in those conversations, because they are, the quarry is good, but it's not good, when it's being abused to your other point, Senator Green, to hold people in bondage to economic wealth and things. So if you can't get a decent wage job because of the quarry that was actually designed to protect from something else, then that kind of puts, people in my community and other communities, at a disadvantage. So even maybe, from looking at those things from a racial lens, like the same things that impact me don't impact, a lot of people on the screen here tonight. So just something to think about when we think about racial disparities when it comes to quarry and laws and bills and legislation and things like that.
Thank you, Donald. And something that we've been talking about a great deal is, recognizing that, or really grounding the conversation about gun violence as a public health issue that is largely driven by racial and economic disparity. And there was a study that actually came out of Northeastern University a couple of years back that looked at different variables present in communities that have highest rates of gun violence. And the variable most correlated with a high rate of gun violence is the lack of economic opportunity and lack of social mobility. And so the communities that have been cut off from resources and opportunity, often because of a long history of racist policymaking, whether it be redlining or zoning or transportation or what have you, then end up being communities with higher rates of gun violence. So something that we've adopted at the coalition is to really dig deep into some of those root causes and champion youth jobs and champion economic opportunity policies that will help mitigate some of those long and discriminatory practices. And just to even tie it with the criminal justice reform, one of the bills that we are championing is expungement for young people and taking non-violent offenses off of the records of young people, knowing that when they have something on their record, it really is a barrier for getting housing and employment. And if we want young people to be safe and well, they need concrete resources like housing and employment to be safe and well. So we see that as being really foundational to violence prevention as well, and a way that all of those different factors come together. So I'm going to segue us into talking a little bit more about the public health piece of violence prevention. And I'm going to ask everyone to reflect for a few moments about what do public health-based approaches to violence prevention look like? What would you like to see happen in the Commonwealth that can promote public health solutions to violence and also engage the voices of those people who've been most impacted by gun violence and racial and economic disparity? Senator Cream, would you like to start us?
I do want to say that expungement is my bill, that I have that bill on expungement. So thank you, Ruth, for giving me a shout out here. So obviously, we look at who's affected and what happens as a result of gun violence. So it affects people of all ages and races in this country, but a disproportionate impact on young adults, males, racial and ethnic minorities. So again, you're looking at it as a public health. What can you do in that regard? Mental health issues. We've put a lot of money recently in passing a mental health bill in the Senate, a mental health bill that looks at children, looks at the mental health problems that young people have and the lack of mental health people to deal with it. I filed an amendment on the bill that we just passed that would set up a commission to study what the effect is of incidents that these children had growing up. All these incidents, how did that affect where they are when they get older? So if it becomes a part of our mental health and public health, then we're looking at it in a broader sense, as Ruth said. Among the United States residents 15 to 24, homicides is the fourth leading cause of death for non-Hispanic whites, the second leading cause of death for Hispanics, and the leading cause of death for non-Hispanic Blacks. Why? Homicides. Guns are the leading method of suicide in the United States, accounting for half of all the suicide deaths. Again, homicides, suicides, they're public health issues. And so when we deal with helping to prevent gun violence or dealing with those people who are disproportionately affected, we're dealing with a health issue, mental health, suicide, homicide. While most gun violence does not involve a mass shooting, in 2019, there were 418 mass shootings, killing 464 people and injuring over 1,700. That's hard to believe, but that's happened. Gun violence is not inevitable. It can be prevented through some comprehensive public health approach that keeps families and communities safe and keeps families and communities together and allows parents, for instance, those young people in prison, we should encourage the relationship between them and their families. I have a bill that's no cost phone calls in prison. It's hard to believe, but the sheriffs that are running the prisons are charging extraordinary amounts to prisoners to make phone calls. Well, if we believe that families are important and we believe that children need to grow up with a connection to their family, and they have a dad or a mother in prison who can't afford the phone calls, I think unfortunately a lot of people think that when you go to prison, you throw the key away and that's it and you're locked up. But that doesn't happen because people get out and there's recidivism. So if you don't go to the root, it's going to happen continually. So I have a bill that would allow those people in prison to have some phone calls without having to pay extraordinary amounts for them. That's a way to look at this as well. And again, back to that crime gun data reporting, it would expand our collection of crime guns and maybe make the data more available to researchers. One thing we did in the last criminal justice bill, which I'm happy that we did and we need to continue to think about, in the interview process, we prevented people from looking at someone's CORI until they were a finalist in a job interview. That helped people who had something on their record and may have gone years been once it's on your record, you could be a model citizen, but there was something on your record. And if somebody in a job interview could look at that and could prevent you from getting that job willy-nilly, that you'd be over. It's over. You get no job. So what we did is say, at least until you're a finalist, you cannot ask someone for their query. So at least we got them through the process for people to say, gee, they're great, and maybe we'll overlook some of those things in people's query. Things that we need to do that seem simple, but we need to do them. So we also have to provide the budget resources to treat the gun violence as a public health. And that's what we did in the American Rescue Funds, and that not enough, but we certainly started. So those are just some ideas about how we intertwine gun violence, racial disparity, and public health.
And it really highlights one of the many reasons why I love being in these conversations with you, Senator Cream, because of our 8 legislative priorities. You're connected to so many of them. So, it's really clear that you have made it a part of your work and your worldview of what you do in the State House to really address all of these issues. And it's so appreciated because, yes, it's about the guns themselves, but it's about so many other things related to root causes and access and all the disparities and the public health component of what it means to really dig deep into violence prevention. So thank you for that. And with that, I want to turn it to Donald just to reflect on that public health approach and what solutions you want to see and how we can best engage the voices of folks who've been most impacted.
Thank you again, Senator Cream. I think Senator Cream hit the nail on the head with the mental health piece, because that is like, that's one of the huge disparities in the Black community, right? Someone has mental health issues and, they end up doing 20 years, right, without ever getting that mental health piece taken care of. And then perhaps they get out and then they're worse than when they went in. So, really having the prison system as a way of reforming people for real, but really dealing with that mental health. So I like that. I wanted to kind of point out something different too, along the same lines. And I don't think I've ever heard anyone speak about this data, but, DCF and DYS, if we could look into the data of how many of those young people who, were murdered or, involved in some type of violence, how many of them were DCF involved and DYS involved? Because I think that's also a huge catalyst to, what drives these young people into what they are doing. Senator Cream talked about a parent being in prison and not being able to talk to their children, right? Or vice versa, in the mindset of a child, when they don't have that direct communication with their parents, somewhere in the back of their mind, they're thinking, my parents don't love me, which also propels them into a deeper relationship with the streets because they're looking for that parental type of love. And so I feel like if we did a little more research, and then restructured DCF, in the work that I do, I have a lot of interaction with DCF, and a lot of it's, policies too, they kind of keep it operating the same way that it operates in DYS as well. So really looking, doing a deeper dive into that data and just making it, presentable so that everyone can see it. And then it's not only a handful of people fighting that battle for the change. That's connected also to what I would like to see within the Commonwealth. But then the last part of your question, that was, how do we engage the voices, right, of those most impacted? I feel like, having them lead in the conversation. What I find most times, with different panels, not this one, but what I find most times with a lot of panel discussions, right, is the folks who are behind the scenes are not the ones, leading the conversation. And so you have people making decisions on your behalf that really don't understand, you know, what your what your situation is like, right? So if you're a millionaire, you don't ever think about how much it costs to buy groceries, right? But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, or even like paycheck and every other paycheck to buy groceries, you know, we just have two different thoughts on life. So really having those folks who are impacted by gun violence, by trauma in the inner city, you know, formerly incarcerated, single mothers, you know, trying to make ends meet, have them lead the conversation, giving them the power, and even, you know, giving them those jobs. So let's say they do make it to the fourth round, right? And then they say, oh, I really like Ruth, but she got this little thing here that actually happened like 30 years ago, you know, when she was a teenager. And so those things, you know, we have to start restructuring even that conversation, you know, and changing the language of those conversations so that the people who actually are impacted are leading. And then we alongside them say, hey, I think this is going to be the best practice after we listen to what they say. And that's really what I would like to see happen more of. You know, Senator Cream, you're an anomaly. You know, is very few of you in the government field that actually champion for gun laws and, you know, for reform, gun reform, and, you know, criminal justice reform. Is very few of you. So I give you big kudos tonight, because you are one of the few people I know. I know a couple of others like, you know, Rep. China Tyler, Rep. Liz Miranda. You know, I know they do great work. City Council at large, Councilor at Large, Julia Mahia. You know, they're fighting the good fight, but, you know, you need probably over half of that to really see a big dent in what we need to see done. But really, you know, being okay with, you know, folks like me and others that just come sit down at the table and let us lead that conversation, because, you know, we know a lot of what's going on, and we know things that some people may not know, and we can just help, you know, guide that conversation where it's beneficial. And I'll close with this thought. Rob Lewis said this in the This Ain't Normal documentary towards the end, and he was saying, you know, when, you know, why wait until, you know, gun violence hits the suburban areas, right? He said we should be working on that already. And then he said that, and then Sandy Hook came, right? And, you know, other places. So it's a gun violence is just an issue for all of us, you know, because you just never know who's in the car next to you, who's in the car behind you, who's in the car in front of you. And if everyone doesn't look at it the same way and really utilize those voices who have been impacted the most, you know, we won't see many things change long term. So that's my little bit there. Thank you, Lisa. I see you putting those comments in the box too. Thank you.
So can I just add one thing,
Sure.
building on what Donald said? Two things, Donald. I couldn't agree more. And when the first bill that was filed on police violence, I filed it with Representative Liz Miranda. We filed it together, and I couldn't agree more that we need to listen to the voices of the people that are on the ground, you might say. But gun violence also knows no color. Sandy Hook, the area of the Sandy Hook, is an area different than Dorchester. Somebody going into a school and killing all those children can happen anywhere. And that's where it can be a public health problem for everyone. And so I think I just want to make sure that people know that we can't say, well, we live here in this nice white upper class community, and people over there suffer. They may have more, but we're not immune from what can happen with gun violence where we sit. And so I think that I hope that message comes across today as well, that issue transcends every community, even though it disproportionately affects your community, but it affects my community as well. So that's why I started with the concept of working together. But I want people to know that we need to do something about gun violence because we're in a bad place wherever we live.
And Donna, did you want to say something before I jump in?
Just wanted to say thank you for highlighting that point, Senator Cream. As you were talking, I'm thinking about, because gun violence just really does not have, it doesn't have a racial barrier. It doesn't have a gender barrier. It just, some days it could be anything, a gentleman. I don't know if, I like movies. I don't know if you've ever watched Unhinged, but Unhinged is
Yeah.
is the equivalent to, what we're talking about, right? A man just having a bad day, and then he goes into a whole bunch of things, and we see a lot of this with the gun violence because I'm a firm believer. If you don't carry a gun, you really won't need a gun if you don't carry it. And so the problem we have is so many people carrying, whether they're licensed or not now, with anger issues too. So, it's not just Dorchester. It's definitely in other places. So thank you for highlighting that, Senator Cream.
And I think, for me, just listening to the conversation now, it also just reminds me how much gun violence is really so many different issues wrapped into one sort of umbrella term of gun violence. Gun violence is community-based homicides, it's domestic violence homicide, it's firearm suicide, which we haven't even talked about this evening, which is actually the majority of deaths from guns are suicide. It is, we're seeing guns being used in political discourse. We're seeing guns being used in the context of hate and extremism. Like, we have many different issues that are all wrapped up into the umbrella of gun violence that are going to take many different kinds of approaches. And it really speaks to me of the importance of coalition building and bringing folks together who are doing different parts of the work, who are coming at this from different perspectives, because I think that's how we're really going to move the needle on what guns are doing in our communities. And this leads me to the last question I want to pose to the panel, and I want to make sure we have a few minutes at the end for questions and answers. There was an interest in talking about what action looks like. What does it look like to be an effective ally for change? And what action steps can everyone who has joined us for this conversation take to help all of us move the needle and change the narrative on gun violence? Donna, would you like to take that first?
So, that's the ally piece is very important. And I'll just go back, not to shocking our people again, right? But just thinking about last year when George Floyd was brutally killed by the police officer, and that kind of started a movement across the country, actually across the planet, for criminal justice reform, police reform, all these different things, right? But one thing that stood out to me, is that the real work has to come from our white brothers and sisters. It just has to, because, we've been fighting. Black people have been fighting since they came to the country, right? And, the Indians, they've been fighting since they've been in the country when the European, regime came in. And, our white colleagues just have to lead the way when it comes to changing policies, pushing and tugging and holding one another accountable. Something Senator Cream said that's so important, right? So if I happen to live in Newton, I'm white, I live in Newton, I'm Jewish, I live in Newton, and I look at Dorchester and say, that's those people's problem, right? But I'm not saying, you know what, how can I fix that problem? Because that problem is my problem. Though we may not look alike, that's still my brother, my sister, and we don't see each other that way right now. But I feel like if more of my white brothers and sisters said, you know what, we're gonna roll our sleeves up and we're gonna fight this fight until this thing changes. We're not going to say, you know, we can't do this or we can't do that. We're just going to do it. And then we start fighting against, you know, just all the barriers until, you know, something simple as, you know, the conversation has been going on for the last few months about reparations, right? Let's stop talking about it. Let's stop digging data on those things, and let's just do it as a country. Because, you know, there's like 5% who are actually the wealthiest in the country, and then there's trickles everywhere else. But, you know, that's how we ally. You know, that's how you can be an ally for the change that needs to happen. You know, get involved. And I believe that will be the force that drives, you know, like when Martin Luther King marched, you know, he marched with love, even though he was beat, even though people died around him, right? Even though he lost his life for the cause. You know, we have to be okay. If I lose my life to save a life, then I did what I was supposed to do on the planet. So that's what I have.
Thank you for that call to action, Donald. Senator Cream, if you want to reflect on some action steps for everyone today, that would be fabulous.
Well, one form of action is what's happening tonight. So this is the second panel that I've done. I did one at Temple Rayam and now here. And if we had these kinds of forums in more places where people don't think that they suffer from these things, then that would be great. And we would make more people understand and become interested. You can, if you have an issue that you care about, you could research it, see if there's a bill. Anyone on this call could contact my office and bring up an issue and see if there's a bill and advocate for that bill or join with a group. Donald was absolutely right. By joining together, then we can work together. And again, getting involved with a group like Ruth Sakin's group, a coalition. And there are several coalitions on gun violence. And in making a difference by people come on and they hear these forums and they are surprised. They get information they didn't really know before they heard this. This is a little not the topic, but similarly, I was unaware, certainly until I had been elected for some time, that women in prison when they gave birth were chained. Now, I've had 2 children. Where was I going during childbirth? And they took women prisoners and chained them. We've had to pass a law just a few years ago that couldn't exist anymore. So all of us are so sometimes unaware until, God forbid, something terrible strikes our community. And then we say, wow, this really exists. But it exists. And learning about it is a way to try and do something about it. And so that's the best thing, by joining, by getting together with other groups so that we can learn from them and they can learn from us. And it's important for, as Donald says, so when I filed that first police bill with Representative Miranda, the Black and Brown community came forward and they also said, well, this is our problem. And this is something we understand, but this is not going to get solved if it was only one group's problem. It's going to get solved if it's everyone's problem. So to what you're saying, Donald, I think, you know, learning about it and having these kinds of programs are wonderful. So here's to more of these. I don't know, Ruth, we could be pretty busy, but I think it's a great thing to people to learn.
Yeah, I think we have an offer of us doing this again for another group is what I'm hearing, but you know, just building off of this theme of keeping the conversations going and making this an issue that we all own. You know, whether it's a child where I live in Sharon or it's a child that lives in Roxbury, that's my kid. And I have a sense of responsibility because that's my kid. So, you know, really owning that. And I would also say, keep the conversation going with more panel discussions, but bring this to your dinner tables, to your Shabbat dinner tables, to services, and to be an ambassador and to get the word out and get more folks energized to own this. is a way that you can also really be an ally and make change. And even just nitty gritty, if folks are interested, Senator Cream has offered to be in contact with her. You can be in contact with us at the coalition and learn about some of the work we're doing and our legislative priorities. January, February is going to be a busy time for advocacy to try to move some of these bills forward. And so if folks are interested in that work, we'll have lots of resources to offer. But I want to tie this part of our conversation up because I know we're really running out of time, and we wanted to make sure there was opportunity for some questions and answers. So just thank you, Senator Cream. Thank you to Donald for the conversation. And I would really love it if folks who are with us, I think that the prompt was to just unmute if you would like to ask a question. I did see Lisa had a couple of comments in the chat too. So I don't know if Lisa, you wanted to post some of those, or if there are others that would like to jump in with a question. Can also use the raise hand function if that feels easier. We can be really informal about it. Is there anyone who wanted to ask a question?
I just had a question. I'm a social studies teacher in one of the local communities, and I'm just curious if, particularly for Senator Cream and maybe the two of you also, if with the civics project that is now part of our state mandate for 8th and 11th graders, given that our young generations are the ones who are, certainly in the school systems being impacted by gun violence, and certainly some of them also in their homes, depending on the communities if that is a good way for us to be, is that something that would be a good way to use that civics project that's coming forward to meet with people, to get involved with your organizations, to get involved with writing to the state senators and so forth and representatives?
I would actually love to jump in with a response to that because it's a great question. It's something near and dear to my heart. I've been thinking a lot about education for young people, about gun violence, but also about civic engagement. I'm the mom of 19-year-old twins, and my kids didn't get a lot of this kind of education when they were in school. And so I think about that a lot. And one of the things that we have started working on, we have a full-time community organizer, and we're in the process of developing an advocacy training that's going to get to young people and help them learn more about how they can be an agent of change when it comes to violence prevention, but also just learn more about the State House and legislative process and talking with legislators and municipal leaders, because we do see that as being critically important to our future, is to get more young folks engaged in these conversations. I don't know if either of my colleagues also wanted to respond to the question.
It is a good question. I'm going to jump in right after Sandy Hook, and when there were various shootings in schools, there was and right when we did the red flag bill, part of how we got that bill passed was that a lot of the schools had walkouts. In Newton, some of the teachers were helpful, some were not, but the kids walked out. I met with a group of junior high kids and worked with them, and we talked about doing a bill on gun violence. And so I'm a firm believer that our young people have a lot to say, and they certainly had a lot to say on issues of gun violence. They came to my office and they said, we are the ones that are afraid. This is about us. I don't want to have a bulletproof backpack. And that's what the conversation was about. Should we give teachers guns? Should kids have bulletproof backpacks? Sort of wrong thinkings in my mind, but whatever. They wanted to be part of it. So having kids in school be involved in these things is wonderful. There are many, many young people involved now in climate action. So I do feel that those kinds of programs for kids is great.
And taking it back, I'm sorry, I'll finish it up, but just taking it back in terms of action as we think about it as Temple Emmanuel members, I don't know if our religious school or program is a place where we could be talking about this as well. I just think that you know, it's their generations coming forward. How are we going to change and make people agents of change and activists? And I think that it might be something we could work on in that regard.
Donald, do you want to jump in?
I was just gonna say when I was, a few years ago, when I was in middle school, we learned all this stuff. We learned about politics and things, and I don't know where it shifted at, but I went to the James E. Mackey in the South End, and we learned. We learned simple stuff like don't, when you're running for office, don't slander your opponent, right? We learned things like if Ruth has a store on this corner, don't put one across the street from Ruth, And so those were just ethical things we learned growing up, along with politics. So I think if our young people actually learned those things, I think that would be a great opportunity for them to be the change agents that you're talking about, Jacqueline.
Thank you. And Judy, I saw you had your hands up. Did you want to jump in?
Yes, I'm wondering why there is no curbing on magazines to sell guns. Because anybody can pick up a magazine and get a gun. Why isn't there more control on that?
Senator Cream, you want to tackle that one? So I know you've been thinking about those issues.
Understanding, I was getting I was getting a lot of sound in the back, so I was having a little trouble understanding what. So if you want to repeat the question to me, it had an echo. I don't know if anyone else had that. Mine
the
had-
question.
My question was,
Oh, good. I can hear
my
you now.
question is why a magazine gun so freely being able to get a hold of, and you can buy a gun without any credentials?
Well, we do have some limitations on large capacity guns. Maybe we don't have enough of them, but we do have some. And I know the Attorney General is working very hard on kinds of things on those fake guns that look like real guns, trying to hold people's feet to the fire about not being able to have those guns. We can't stop the use of guns or people buying guns because there are people that say that that's what our Second Amendment says. I'm not sure I read the Second Amendment the same way they do, but there are some people that say that. But we certainly could make it harder. We have a loophole in our background checks. Right now, if you go to a gun show or you buy from an individual, there's a different standard for background checks. So you bring up some good points. We have limitations, but we need more. So thank you. And those are the kinds of issues we all need to work together on. They're called ghost guns. And I know the Attorney General is working on those ghost guns. I mean, when I read that you could go online and figure out how to make a gun, I was astounded. I don't even know how to file legislation on that one.
And with the ghost guns, the work that we've been doing at the coalition, so a ghost gun refers to buying a kit that's up to 80% of the parts of a gun, but it's not considered a gun because it's not the whole thing. So you can get it online and have it shipped to your home, and then you construct the gun, add the rest of the parts, and there's no serial number. It's not registered, why it's called a ghost gun. So at the coalition, we got involved with advocating along with partners from around the country for a federal rules change that would classify those kits as guns and make it much more difficult to distribute them through the mail, with the hope that that would cut off the supply. I do want to do a time check though, because we are a little over time. It is 9:08, and Elisa, I'll just ask for you to jump in. Do we want to take one last question? Do we feel like we need to tie things up? So, please let us know how you want
one last question would be great, and then we'll tie things up.
And I can't see everyone, so I don't know if anyone has their hand up or if there's someone that wants to jump in with one more question.
Feel free to unmute.
I have one unless someone else wants to talk. I don't think this is something you can really answer quickly, but I was a special ed teacher in various communities for 30 years. And the one overarching issue that my kids had to do with mental health. And I know from, and agree totally with everything Donald said, and Ruth and you and Senator Cream said, that the mental health is tied to the home, to the economic viability of the family, to just so many things. But what is there we can do? Is there anything we can do to try to get schools to look into, to be more aware of the mental health of the kids at risk? I mean, the situation in Michigan, I think it was last week, not 2 weeks ago, really shook me because I had a kid like that. And from a Friday afternoon when we discovered what he had written to Monday morning, mental health people had been called in. The child was not allowed back in the school. His parents were called in, but he wasn't sent to jail. He was sent to a 45-day mental health eval, which is what he needed. I just, there seems to be too much of a gap between where the kids are coming from who get involved with this and the solutions, and violence, unfortunately, is the outcome. I don't know if that's a question or a statement. I apologize.
Well, there were many people that hope those parents of that boy are actually really held accountable. So you gave an example of someone whose parents found out there was a problem and they took the right steps. They called the mental health people versus
So the school did, the parents weren't.
okay, versus the parents buying them a gun. So you're right, and this is something that we need to think about. The mental health problems are great. That's why, as I said, the Massachusetts Senate just voted a huge bill, and we took a lot of money from those American Rescue Plan to try and do more for mental health. Mental health, whether it's the kids or
Parents.
so. As I said, my amendment on the mental health bill was a commission to study the trauma of kids for childhood situations and what kind of trauma that had for the kids. That's exactly what we're talking about as far as mental health, the impact of trauma on young people, things that happen early on in their life. And incidentally, that's everywhere. That's not just disproportionately affected by communities of color. You do see kids with terrible mental health problems doing terrible things everywhere. So those are things we need to provide better services for.
I would just add too, that wasn't just a young man. His parents probably have some mental health issues.
Right.
It's why it turned out the way it turned out.
Thank you for that question. I think it's a great way for us to tie things up and just really, again, grounding ourselves in the importance of caring for the emotional well-being of young people, of our communities, as a really critical component of not just preventing violence, but promoting peace. I think that ability to really hold young people and care for them is a huge part of that work of preventing more trauma and making sure that we have peaceful communities. So thank you for the question and the comment. I think it really ends us in a nice place. I know for me, it's been a pleasure to be with everyone this evening. And just thank you to Temple Emmanuel for inviting us to be in conversation with you about this. And I just want to appreciate my colleagues and friends on the screen with me, Senator Cream and Donald Osgood. And I'll turn it back over to Elisa.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Senator Cream. Thank you, Donald. We're going to roll our sleeves up. As Donald said, things get solved if it's everybody's problem. And step number one really is to educate ourselves. And I think that's what this was about. I feel a little smarter, a little bit better informed, and let's please keep the conversation going. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Be well.
Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
for asking. It was a pleasure
Thank
being on the panel with Donald
you.
and Lou.
Thank you, Senator Crane.
Thank
Ruth.
you.
Thank you. Temple Emmanuel, is all of y'all.
Donald.
Thank you again. Appreciate you.